Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Dector, and I'm the Comprehensive and Neighborhood Planning Manager for the City of Flagstaff. Joining me tonight for this webinar is Elsa Erling. Elsa is the Associate Planner for the City of Flagstaff, and Melissa Shaw from Coconino County is the Senior Planner there for Long Range Planning, and she's also available tonight for questions. We have about a 25 to 30-minute presentation where I'm going to go over the big picture of some of the basic information about the draft plan, and then I'll hand it off to Elsa, who is going to provide an overview of the comments we received in the first 30 days of our 60-day public review. We'll pause in between speakers for a few questions, but we ask you to hold your questions and stay on mute until we hit those pauses. If you would like to ask a question by being asked to unmute and speak, please use the raise hand function in Teams. If you have trouble finding that, you can also put a C for comment or a Q for question in the chat. Please type in the chat if you're having any trouble, so as not to interrupt the flow of the presentation since we're recording. And with that, I will just kick us right off so we can get started on this great topic of the regional plan, the future, where we're going as a community. So the regional plan, as you may know, is a policy guide for the whole region. So not just Flagstaff, but the surrounding areas of Coconino County. It is really focused on land use, but it covers a lot of related topics like housing and transportation and the economy and climate action and our natural resources. This one document serves as the general plan for the city, which means it will be sent to a ballot for a vote by city residents, and an amendment to the Coconino County Comprehensive Plan. The comprehensive plan is also being updated simultaneous to this draft, and we are coordinating the input that we receive through both processes to make sure it's reflected in both documents. Next slide. So these two paths for one document means that we are using it in slightly different ways. And it's important to know that because there is some differences in the city's application. So one thing the city does is we use this document to support a 100-year water supply designation. We're a water provider. We have a utility, where Coconino County does not. We also have, for Coconino County's comprehensive plan does not have a map of area types or land use categories. And so this map serves as a united map for both the city and county as part of this regional plan. So there are some things that maybe our other planning documents don't have or that are needed that are variable between the city and county. So we do this all in one document, but you'll see in some places in the draft plan, we kind of bifurcate and we have a city part and a county part, even though we're all working towards the same goals. Next slide. This is a map of our region. It includes Belmont, Fort Valley, Timberline, Fernwood, Doney Park, and Kachina Village. And the reason it's kind of a square is because this is our transportation planning boundary. It's the boundary of our metropolitan planning organization called MetroPlan. So we do a lot of coordinated transportation planning in this area, in addition to resources and our land use planning. Next slide. We think about this plan as a foundation for a lot of other planning efforts that you may have heard of or participated in. For example, if you live in Doney Park, Timberline, Fernwood, you might have participated in the area plan for that part of the Coconino County. If you live in the city of Flagstaff, you might have participated in the Plaza Vieja or the Southside Plan or the High Occupancy Housing Plan. Those planning efforts are what we call area or specific plans, and they are part of this green slice of our planning pyramid. The planning pyramid used to be very flat, but we've made it three-dimensional, and we show both the right side, which includes those kind of area and specific plans, but it also includes some other kind of plans on the left side, that are not as directly tied to development decision-making in the region. But they are very important because they're strategic and master plans that tell us how our utilities are going to work, how we're going to achieve our affordable housing objectives, how the carbon neutrality plan is going to be executed within the city. These two paths to implementing the plan are both very valuable, but they have different legal requirements. They have different ways that they are carried out. And so the new design of this planning pyramid really recognizes the strong foundation that the regional plan provides, and also that there's multiple paths to doing the work of implementing it. Next slide. Just if this is the first time you've shown up for a regional plan meeting, and maybe that's true, maybe that's not, we have had numerous engagement opportunities that have been building on each other over the last 2.5 years. And so even before this 60-day public review, we have had numerous workshops on different concepts and scenario choosing and asking for collaborative input on how land use decisions could be made in the region. We've convened both a technical advisory group and on the next slide, also a committee that basically reviewed chapter by chapter all the draft content in this plan and helped us compile it. That group was started off as about 25 people and kind of became 20 by the end. There's always a little attrition with long processes. But they had 15 meetings over 10 months and did an incredible amount of work helping staff and the community comments get absorbed into a more cohesive document. So if you see any of them, make sure you thank them for the commitment and time that they made to this process. Next slide. During the 60-day public review, and there are about 2 weeks left in the 60-day public review, we have a really interesting way of participating on our website. This is hosted by Coconino County, and it is called a Conveo site. So this Conveo site allows you to go into the chapters of the plan, and so there's a little drop-down menu where Elsa's pointing her cursor, and that'll let you see all the different chapters. And then if you click the comment bubbles in the upper right-hand corner, you can actually see everyone's comments who's commented so far. So this is a really collaborative way to comment on the document. You can even respond to other people's comments or up or down vote them. Next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about just a big overview of what's in the draft plan. This draft plan does have fewer goals and policies. We consolidated and prioritized a lot of goals and policies. The current plan has 97 goals and it has over 500 policies. That's an overwhelming amount of policy direction, and some of it was conflicting. And that has been an issue in implementing the plan we currently have. So we've gotten it down to about 23 goals and about 80 policies. So much reduced, but hopefully still the most germane things to land use decision making are covered. And that's something you can comment on. We also have gone from having a generalized map to having a parcel specific future land use map and land use categories. And we'll talk a little more about that. We've also added a section that includes implementation guidelines and action items, which are really directions for staff that don't apply to that right side of the triangle that is associated with development review, but are important for staff if we want to have clarity in the direction we're going and updating of code. It also has, as I said, more clarity on what is going to apply in a development application and what is our strategic future direction for land use decision making. That's really about how the city and county make and define policies. We also have simplified the major plan amendment categories and added a list of administrative changes. And I want to go over that in a little more detail and explain what we mean by that. Next slide. Sorry, before I do that, well, there are also important to know that this plan sets priorities. It doesn't have what the current plan has, which I call the mom and apple pie problem, where it has 500 great ideas and there's something in there everybody likes, but it is not a meaningful document that's prioritized and thoughtful. And therefore we had a lot of trouble making progress on the goals and policies that we did have in the current plan. The priorities have been set largely by public engagement so far, but we are looking at them with all these comments, both internal and external, through the 60-day review. And we can consider adding or changing them somewhat. Excuse me. Next slide. The plan is organized into a couple different sections. The first two chapters go over how to read and orient yourself to the document. The policy section is associated with that development review side of the triangle. It includes goals and policies that would be evaluated for development cases and code updates. And it includes a growth illustration that has parcel-specific land use categories and goals and policies around growth and land use. It also has an implementation section that is really about the vision side of the triangle, which has guidelines for what we need to do in implementing all policies within the city. And it also has action items, which are the to-do list associated with the regional plan's future next 10 years of work. Next slide. I want to talk about the plan amendment process because I mentioned it a little bit earlier and I said we'd get back to it. This plan and all plans like this are living documents. So though we send it to voters and voters ratify it, we then spend 10 years kind of keeping it alive through plan amendments. And there are two kinds of plan amendments. There are major amendments and minor amendments. The city code defines a major amendment as substantial alterations, or what I short-term call the big deals, to the city's land use mixture or balance. So really, these are about land use categories and involve changes that have an impact on large areas or can affect other issues or policies. They alter the substance or intent of major general plan policies. So these are ones that are kind of a bigger change than we would have anticipated. There are always lots of little changes. So for example, in the last 10 years, we did 3 city staff initiated major plan amendments, and we did about 23 minor plan amendments that were a mix of proposals by the city and proposals by private property owners. So this plan, just like the ones we've had before, is probably going to get updated pretty regularly. So it's worth paying attention to how we define these categories because the major plan amendments have longer processes and more public engagement requirements. Next slide. So the major plan amendments require a pre-application meeting. The application for a plan amendment has to precede other development applications. So you can't apply for your zoning map amendment or an annexation until you've completed the major plan amendment. Like the comprehensive update to the plans, it requires a 60-day public review, and it must be processed within 1 calendar year of a complete application. So it has a really tight clock. So once you submit a major plan amendment and staff deems it complete, you have 1 year to finish it. You can't drag it on and on forever. It's got to be made in a pretty timely way. It also has a higher bar for public hearings. It requires 2 planning and zoning hearings at different locations. So that's sometimes you'll see that planning and zoning is meeting somewhere that's not City Hall. And that's because it's processing a major plan amendment, not because we had like a water leak or something. And then it also requires 2/3 majority of the city council or board of supervisors to approve it. Minor amendments are a less burdensome process. They don't have this kind of 2 decision-making phase. They can be done concurrent with rezoning and annexation cases. They're always noticed just as part of the case. They need a straight majority vote and they don't have any extra hearings. Both of these processes, though, always look at the goals and policies. So that content of chapter 3 and 4 in the plan is relevant to both of these processes. Next slide. This is what our current major plan amendments look like. We have a major plan amendment category for our urban growth boundary, for reducing our employment areas. There's a category we are not carrying forward called special district that's considered a major plan amendment. making big jumps from rural to urban triggers one. Some of the ways we make changes around activity centers currently requires a plan amendment. Parks and open space, changing our mix of activity centers, changing a residential corridor to a commercial, and adding or deleting goals and policies. These are very much drawn around how the current plan is structured. So there's no like state statute that says here's what's major and here's what's minor. Every plan defines it on their own. So this is a pretty long list. You can see there's like 9 big categories and each of them have multiple bullets. So on the next slide, we'll show you what the proposed categories are. So our proposed categories are a little simpler. Basically, we've moved towards thinking about the urban growth boundary instead of activity centers as where we would like to see increased density and intensity. And I'll explain what the urban growth boundary is a little bit later on in the presentation in more detail, but basically it's a boundary that the city uses to say, here's where we will provide utility services, and here's where we do not plan to provide utility services. And that would include going that basically if you're inside that boundary, we'd like to see you proposing increases in density and intensity of uses. And if you're outside that boundary, we prefer to keep the density and intensity low so we can preserve resources and the natural setting and the rural setting rather than seeing it go up. So that's basically what 1 and 2 are about. 3 is that if you have a parcel that you would like to identify as a corridor, which is a category of land use that's largely commercial and multifamily, and you don't have access to an arterial or collector road, so a road big enough to serve a more intense use, that can trigger a major plan amendment. Any decisions that decrease the area of parks, open space, or federal lands and working landscapes, which is a new category in the current plan that basically applies to federal lands around the city of Flagstaff within the region and state lands that are some of the state lands we don't anticipate will be developed, and in holdings to the national forest, so private lands that are completely surrounded by national forest. And then the last category is actually just deleting a goal and policy would also trigger a major plan amendment. So we went from having 9 categories with a lot of sub bullets. We probably really had about 15 total to having 5. And that's our simplified approach to major plan amendments. Minor amendments are basically anything you don't list as a major amendment is minor unless you do an additional step. So here are some examples of things that would become minor amendments. If we are adding or modifying a goal or policy in any chapter, if we are changing the land use category for a parcel within the urban growth boundary in some ways, in a way that's opposite of the way it's described in the major category, changing the functional class of a road. So functional class is when we call something a collector or an arterial. Changing the urban growth boundary or modifying the boundary of an employment or research area. Some of those things are currently major amendments. They would become minor. So next slide. My administrative changes are a new category of things. Our current plan does not allow any administrative changes. So Melissa and I, who are the people who administer the plan, if we find a typo, we can't fix it. We have to go through a whole plan amendment process to do that. And there have been a lot of requests in the last few years to have the plan be more usable online and be more interactive and have more hyperlinks and things along those lines. To be able to do that, we need the ability to keep those up to date without, if I had to go through an amendment process and multiple public hearings just to change out the URL in the plan, it's not a very nimble part of the document. So we are basically putting this forward to the public to ask for some permissions to make minor changes. Scrivener's errors, if you don't know what those are, under the second bullet, are basically like minor typos or misstatements. So like in the last slide, you might have seen an error on one of the bullets. That's basically a Scrivener's error. Sorry, my voice isn't holding up. Can you go back, Elsa? Sorry. The other categories of administrative changes are really about not creating duplicative processes. So if the city or county by ordinance or dedication or in their jurisdiction make changes to the future growth illustration or identified parks and open space, the other jurisdiction should just be able to adopt that. Right now we have the county updated the future growth illustration in Belmont and the city updated it in Central Flagstaff. And those two maps look totally different. So the county's map still shows the old mapping and the city's map still shows the old mapping in Belmont. So we'd like to keep those better tied together. The last few things in here are any factual updates to informational maps or appendices. So like some of the informational maps have data that's maintained by other organizations. And when they update their data, we may also want to update and include it in the plan. And then the last thing is there is a table in chapter 4 called the Table of Zoning Compatibility. That is based on the city and county zoning code. So if the zoning code changed the name of a zone or changed the criteria for a zone and it needed to move in this table, we'd like to be able to include that in the zoning ordinance and not have to come back and do separate plan amendment hearings. So those are the changes that we would propose be administrative. So these are areas I'm highlighting because we'd love to get your comments on them. If any of this is a concern or if you have thoughts on it, please provide comments in this area. Next slide. So before I hand it off to Elsa, and I'll take some questions after this slide, we'll take about 5 minutes of questions. As we go through the comments we've received so far, bear in mind that's the staff and the project managers set up some critical success factors. We reviewed these with our committee, and the committee actually endorsed these as well. One, this plan needs to be feasible and implementable. So while it's setting big goals and setting up big ideas for the future, it has to be something we can do within the timeline of the plan. And that we could, maybe we don't know how we're going to do it yet, but it has to be like a reasonably foreseeable to do. So I know we've passed a law that says we're going to allow flying cars in Arizona, and maybe some people think that by 2060 we could have light rail to Flagstaff, but that's beyond the feasible and implementable within the life of the plan. It has to be as user-friendly and concise as possible. So we've worked hard to avoid repetition. It should reflect community values. So as you can see, we've done a lot of engagement to understand community values. And this process right now is also about setting that as a priority. The document should set clear priorities and minimize conflicting priorities. And one thing I will say is that repetition in the document, so repeating a word or idea over and over again, is one of the major sources of conflicting policies in our current plan. An example is we talk about activity centers in several different sections, and we define that term differently in a lot of different places in the current plan. That set up some conflicting language until we did some amendments to adjust that. That is one of the goals I have as a project manager, is that this plan be ready to use on day one and not require us to spend a few years amending it before we could use it. It also needs to incorporate our diverse cultural perspectives and our critical thinking about a lot of big topics for the region. We also hope that the plan can consider the vision of our different existing area plans, clarify how our activity centers will be viewed and how they'll be achieved, and address our cost constraints and affordability concerns as a community. Next slide. I think with this, I will pass it to Elsa, who has done an excellent job of combing through all the comments with our intern, Joe O'Connell, over the last few weeks. And I think she's going to give you a short summary so that you don't have to read all 462 comments to know where we are right now. Take it away, Elsa.
All right. I guess I'll first pause if anyone had any questions that they wanted to ask now.
That's right.
Okay, I don't see anyone raising their hand, so yeah.
And if you want to raise your hand or add something to the chat in the next minute, just I can try and I'll manage the chat for you for a little bit.
So the 60-day public review, it started October 20th. On November 19th, we pulled some of the comments out, and I'm going to give an overview, sort of Cliff Notes version of some of what we're seeing from those comments. And if you haven't, maybe some of you have already seen the plan and commented on it, but if not, this summary will give you a taste of what's in the plan and where you might, things that you might care about that you might want to go weigh in on, or if there's, topics missing that you think are important, we'd love to get comments on them from you. So we've, at about the halfway point of the 60-day public review, we had 462 total comments approximately. 233 were online on that Conveo site that Sarah talked about. And then we also had a series of in-person workshops, and there were about 230 comments from those workshops. The majority of the comments, or I guess a little under half of the comments, were focused on goals and policies. And if you attended the workshops, you'll know that the workshops were very focused on getting comments on those goals and policies. So that aligns with our goals for the workshops. And then there are 102 that are on the some of the more narrative and informational sections that were in that implementation section, the topical chapters. They provide some background information on current conditions and information that supports the goals and policies and action items. And then maps were another area that got a lot of comments. And the future growth illustration, which I'll talk about, is a key map that we're looking for comments on. So after the 60-day public review, staff will be publishing a list of all the written comments and responses to how they were addressed. At the moment, we haven't yet started addressing these comments, so what I'm presenting here is just a taste, but I don't have the answers and responses yet. Of course, we want to wait for everyone to weigh in before making revisions to the document. So I'm going to go through a couple goals and policies that had the most comments and generated discussion. So that's what the next few slides will be. So thinking of growth and land use in that category, this policy DP3, DP stands for development patterns, says that in all neighborhoods create more opportunities for accessory dwelling units, ADUs, townhouses, apartments, duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, and other missing middle and multifamily housing. Some of the comments that this policy generated included, some concerns about density, comments about the challenges of small scale developers in terms of cost, or considerations with the parking requirements and how that affects these projects. Comments about the effect of this missing middle housing on town site, and questions about ADUs, such as, their appropriateness in different neighborhoods, their affordability, and their impact on housing affordability here. And then also questions about, whether the city can provide resources for ADUs, such as pre-approved plans. Parking is a big topic that got a lot of comments throughout the document. This is the main goal on parking. It says manage the supply and costs of parking to support a safe and walkable environment, successful and consistent enforcement, and to ensure efficient use of parking infrastructure for all users. And I also note there's one of our action items, which is the checklist for the city and county, actions that carry out the goals and policies, is to look at our winter parking ordinance in the city and look at strategies for making that more flexible, which is in line with the comments that we've gotten on this goal as well. There's also been comments in support of reduced parking minimum requirements and how to manage parking better in neighborhoods with limited space. and also thinking about space for pedestrians and safety as well. On the topic of healthy economy, we have policy HE5, which is about nutrition, food security, and local agriculture activity. So some of the comments here, there's several comments in support of community gardens and local agriculture, but there's also comments expressing concern about the available land and water for these kind of activities. And there's also suggestions, for example, to split this into two policies, one which is about nutrition, food security, and jobs, and one which is more on the local agriculture and production, manufacturing, and distribution of food. In the resource stewardship section, there were three policies in particular that that rose to the top in terms of comments. So RS3 is about dark skies. It's to preserve dark skies as a natural resource that supports ecosystem health and brings scientific benefits to the region. And there are several comments on how to protect this research in a growing region, education, and other considerations in terms of the benefits of dark skies. Then we have RS5 and RS6. RS5 is create resilient and sustainable flood management practices and systems that protect and enhance ecosystems and human health throughout the region. And then RS6 is a little bit longer, so I won't read the whole thing, but it's focused on supporting healthy watersheds. And there are several comments in here about thinking about flood management and how we can employ ecosystem-based solutions and maybe think about these two policies, revise them in a way that includes that phrase. There's also RS7 is recognize and incorporate Indigenous knowledge and cultural practices into natural and cultural resource affairs and projects. And this is another policy that had several comments in support of it, and also questions on you know, how this can be carried out, how Indigenous knowledge can be brought in, you know, by Indigenous people, and where this can apply. Also on the topic of resources and in this same resource stewardship and resilience category, there is this policy CR1 on cultural resources. Says preserve historic buildings, sites, and structures through restoration, rehabilitation, design guidelines, grants, and incentives, and where possible and when not, create opportunities for education, mitigation, and documentation. There's several comments in support of this policy, also suggestions to add more on architecture, aesthetics, and design, either through this policy or in other sections of the document. And this is kind of a change between the current regional plan and this draft new regional plan, is that the existing regional plan has a community character chapter. The proposed draft does not have that chapter. Instead, some of the elements from that chapter are dispersed into other places. And the proposed draft regional plan is sort of architecturally agnostic, a little bit less focused on design, but there have been these comments in support of adding more. Some other suggestions that we've heard so far, more on rail. So we do have some goals and policies on freight, but there's an interest in seeing a goal or policy on expanded passenger rail and railroad crossings, how they can be improved for safety. There's been a suggestion to include a policy in the climate action section about land use reform that can result in reduced carbon emissions. Suggestions also include having a policy about protecting old growth trees and forests. There's been several comments about one of the ideas in the plan is to support infill growth, and there have been several comments about how infill growth can be incentivized in comparison to greenfield development, and the cost of development policies are one area, but where these comments are focused. But there's also suggestions to add this kind of information somewhere else. Um, a policy on mobile home parks in regard to displacement has been suggested. Um, and other suggestions include having a policy that disincentivizes development in hazardous areas. Someone suggested buyouts, and then placing emphasis on the foots in the PROS policy, in the parks, recreation, and open space policies. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the future growth illustration now, which we've referenced a couple times. This is the future growth illustration from the current plan, the 2030 plan. So you can see that it has these different colors that correspond to land use categories that can be rural, suburban, or urban. And then there are these circles that correspond to activity centers. So when we were thinking about how to bring forward a new map for this update, um, there was a process that maybe some of you were involved in um, that involved a workshop to create different growth ideas based on these uncertainties of, thinking of population growth, infrastructure funding, climate change impacts, all of which affect development in the region. And then you may have also participated in the scenario choosing process where there were these different types of scenarios about how the community could grow. And there was a survey, or you may have come to some workshops to select a preferred scenario. And the preferred scenario was translated into a growth concept, which became the future growth illustration. So now this is what the future growth illustration in the draft plan looks like. It's if I flip back, you can see that it's different. It's parcel specific. The centers are there are fewer centers. The urban neighborhoods are um, is an expanded category, and there's a slightly different, there's differences in the lists of land use categories over here. And we do have a version of this that's interactive online, so you can zoom in and see what the designation is for where you live, and let us know if you agree with that designation. So many of the comments that we've gotten so far on the future growth illustration have been in this zoom in section south of I-40, that the John Wesley Powell area has generated a lot of comments at our workshops and online. And there's been several comments in support of higher density in that area, which is currently this light yellow suburban neighborhood. Um, there are comments about the employment district areas, which are this light blue, and where they're designated, some suggesting that some of what's currently designated as employment should be changed to a residential category like suburban neighborhood. And also, for example, comments about the urban centers and urban neighborhoods. So this brown area between Milton and Woodlands Village Boulevard is a suburban center on the proposed map. Some suggestions have been to change this to an urban center. The centers are the highest density areas in the region, where we would see a lot of mixed use development. And so what goes along with this map is the land use framework, and that goes through each of the categories that are on the side here and talks about what the characteristics of those would be, what density corresponds with them, and what zoning corresponds with these categories. And So some of the comments that we've gotten so far on the land use framework section have been about this corridor category. There's been a suggestion to eliminate the suburban corridor, to questions about how transit aligns with the corridors, and support for them being mixed use. Um, and then uh, there's one idea that's not a mapped category, but is still part of the land use framework, is neighborhood commercial, which is a small scale commercial that's within a residential area. It could be something like a home-based business or a pop-up, like a food truck, or it could be something more permanent. And change over time. So we've seen both comments in support of this idea and also concern. For example, there's one comment expressing concern about food safety with home-based businesses. There's been a lot of comments in support of bike and pedestrian connectivity and improvements in multiple categories. And in the land use framework, you'll see many of the guidelines talk about bike and pedestrian connectivity and transit. So it's not just about building form there, it's also how these spaces work to walk through and bike through and drive through as well. And then parking again is a big topic that we've seen in the comments. So some other themes of our comments so far have been the urban growth boundary, which Sarah mentioned before, that I have a map up of as well. Comments about the balance of limited land between residential use, industry, agriculture, and open space. There's some goals and policies that are presenting a balance of these things, and it's definitely open for comment on whether we're striking the right balance there. Um, uh, Comments about the where we're describing something applying for all housing versus attainable and affordable housing. For example, if we're saying support housing development, and how we're using that language, that has been a topic of several comments. Um, Comments about the factors that are at play in the housing emergency that the city's declared and how we're describing them. Comments about native plants, expanding transit service and use, and ADA accessibility. So to talk a little bit about the urban growth boundary, this is a map where the red line is the city limits and the blue line is the urban growth boundary and the purple line is where they overlap. But you can see that there's some areas that are within the city limits, but not, they're outside the urban growth boundary. And then there's also areas that are inside the urban growth boundary and outside the city limits. So they're not completely aligned. And the current plan doesn't, or the proposed plan doesn't have proposed changes to the urban growth boundary, but there is a change in the policies relating to providing utility service in relation to the urban growth boundary. So the current regional plan for 2030 had this policy that development requiring public utility service will be located within the urban growth boundary, and a major plan amendment was required to change the urban growth boundary. So there are some properties that are within the city limits, but the city, because of this policy, could not choose to extend water sewer service to those properties. The proposed change is a policy that allows more flexibility where the city's water services department could choose to extend water and sewer services with consideration for their policies, which would be informed by these implementation guidelines. So the the proposed policy is provide sustainable and reliable water and sewer services within the urban growth boundary, and a minor plan amendment would be required to change the urban growth boundary. And then there are these implementation guidelines, which set some conditions for cases where water and sewer services could be extended. Um, and these would have to be, in order to be in place, the water services section would update their policies in alignment with these guidelines. So if we can certainly go back to this if there are any questions, but I'll also go to our internal comments unless Sarah, you want to say anything.
Melissa actually had an update on how many comments we've received so far through the Conveo. I think at the beginning you said as of November 19th, we had 233 comments via the Conveo site. Melissa looked up just now where we are, and I don't know if you want to unmute and talk a little bit about your update.
Sure, thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Elsa. This is Melissa Shaw with Coconino County, and I did just, excuse me, look on the site, and we are up to 512 online comments. So that plus the 200 and some from the workshops, we're at over 700 comments now total on the plan update. So, we haven't analyzed the additional ones, but we will be doing that shortly.
Yeah, so you too can give us more input. There's plenty of time. There's about 2 weeks left. But yeah, I'm happy to talk a little about internal review. So the city of Flagstaff and Coconino County are also taking this 60 days to test the plan. It's really our first time too working with the plan cover to cover. So for instance, the city planning staff is going through all of the plan material and saying, okay, let's pretend we're applying this to some projects and see what we struggle with, what's clear, what can be applied. So we're doing some of that background work. And then our transportation engineering staff is also going back through the maps one more time in the transportation section. And other sections are also taking time to look through the plan one more time, make sure that it matches other things in their policies. And we're also looking at it for overlap with all of the adopted area and specific plans. So there's work going on our side too, in addition to our over 600 public comments so far, which is a great turnout. Like my goal, I would be very happy to have 1,000 to 1,200 comments on December 19th. I don't know that my intern would love it, but he's awesome and he's going to power through, I think. We also have already identified some places where very innocent sounding policies could end up conflicting with each other. If we have a lot of things where we think it's a big deal to make the changes, we may reconvene our committee. They have said they'd be willing to meet again in January if we needed to present some things back to them. And as Elsa said earlier, not the internal comments might not end up in the spreadsheet, but we will have like an explanation of how they all got incorporated and where the changes came from, essentially between the draft and the final. I always like to remind people when we're talking about the plan that it's a draft. It's really still a draft, and it's the next version that will start becoming the final plan. So we do expect there to be changes to the structure, changes to the content based on all this feedback that we're getting through the 60 days. I wouldn't open up a document for a 60-day public review if people didn't have a chance to meaningfully influence what's included in it. And I don't expect you to go back through the 30 plus hours of committee meeting time to figure that out. We'll make sure that there's a real clear loop on what's going on. And we also have lots of meetings outside of what we've been discussing going on so far. We haven't really mentioned that many of the boards and commissions have started put together subcommittees or have plans on how they are going to assemble a commission level comment and get that to staff. And so we were just right before this meeting, I was at the Transportation Commission. The Bike Advisory Committee has prepared a set of minutes and discussion points for us, and other commissions are working on the same thing. We have a meeting tomorrow with inclusion and adaptive living at the city. So that is like an ongoing process in addition to the open Conveo site, the feedback from the public workshops, the internal comments. Boards and commissions and many other advocacy groups are pulling together comments and looking through the material. So more the merrier. That's my message when I'm here to talk about where we are with comments, because we can't make this the plan the community needs if we're not really having a robust review of the document. So thank you for being here tonight also, and being even interested enough to think about putting comments, whether you put in 2 or 200 individually. It's really valuable for us. and will help in giving the information we need to make confident decisions for the community's future. So I'd like to talk a little bit about what's going to happen when the 60-day review is done, because I think I've pitched to you and Elsa's pitched to you that great comments are rolling in. We'd love to see more. On December 19th at 5 o'clock, we'll be done accepting comments, and we'll be completely moving into analyzing and thinking about updates and moving forward. The staff is going to need a couple weeks to analyze all of these comments and figure out what needs more discussion. If we have complex issues, we're obviously going to convene staff at the city and county and our partner organizations first and go over what we're trying to do. And then second, we will be able to reconvene the committee if there's complex issues we want to run by them before moving forward. We need to complete a final legal review, and that takes several weeks to do. Legal at the city goes over this in a lot of detail because it comes up, this document comes up in a lot of legal decision making around land use decisions. So they want to make sure we don't have anything that's in conflict with state law or with other precedent that we have to be paying attention to. We also then will convene a retreat of the Board of Supervisors, the City Council, and the Planning and Zoning Commission. We're trying to schedule that retreat for March, and we hope to be able to announce the dates for it before the end of the year. But we need to see if we actually can get a quorum of those groups on a given day. We also are looking, after that process, we'll do the revisions based on the retreat, and we'll be rolling right into public hearings at the city. So the city will hold 2 planning and zoning hearings, and then a city council hearing to review what they've already been looking through at the retreat. We will also be then if the city chooses to adopt it, it will go to a ballot initiative, and the ballot initiative will hopefully appear on the November 2025 ballot. In that case, the county is hoping to convene their public hearings in November once they know that the city has moved forward and adopted the plan. So that's a pretty long process. Like, we have a draft plan. It's still going to be almost a year before it's finalized by all the organizations. But there's still a lot of work to do and a lot of chances to come to hearings and speak and provide feedback in those venues. Next slide. So I'll remind you that you can review the plan and just send me what I call the book report. If you want to write me a book report and send it to my email or to Melissa's email. Melissa also loves a book report. And you can send those just directly to us. You can participate in the collaborative review on Conveo and read 500 other comments if that's what's exciting to you. We have 2 more sets of office hours. So Friday from 11 to 2 p.m. This Friday, we will be at the Belmont Fire Station, and the following Friday, we'll be at the Summit Fire Station 32 on Cokefield Road in the Donny Park area. So that's a time when you could just come by and talk to staff. We crack open a plan and talk through your questions. And if you are really interested in a topic that just didn't come up tonight, we can dive in. If there are a few more board and commission meetings happening, I think Indigenous Commission is meeting and discussing next week. So you can look at board and commission agendas if there's a topic you want to see if we're discussing it. But that's kind of coming to a close because the commissions are working on their comments now. Anything else? We have one more slide, I think. So here's the website where you can download the plan if you'd like to, or review the Conveo. If you're looking for a hard copy, there's one you can just pop open at the main and East Flagstaff libraries. You just go ask the reference desk if you can check it out. You can't take it out of the library, but you could sit in a quiet corner and look through it. The CD front counter at the city and county, we have a copy. It's available for you to open. I know the county has it kind of sitting at a little table in their lobby. So there's study areas, essentially. We have provided some hard copies to folks. It does take 2 or 3 days to get a hard copy produced. They are expensive for us to produce. And so we are doing them as needed. So if you want one, just expect it could take 2 or 3 business days to get it to you. So given that we only have about 10 business days till the comment period closes, if you need one, please email me right away so that we can get that request started for you. And thank you. Any questions? I guess we'll pause and see if there's any more questions. I know we've covered a lot of material. you can either raise your hand or put a remark in the chat and we'll answer questions either way. Well, there are no questions. And if you think of something and you want to email it to me or Melissa after the meeting, I'll actually type my email into the chat if you want to click on it and send me any comments or questions. Please do so. We are really happy to hear from you all. Thank you for attending tonight's webinar. And we hope we've answered a lot of questions that you have and inspired you to check out the plan in more detail and send us some more comments. Thank you very much.